Welcome to this most recent episode of the Accad and Koka Report. Today, we have the pleasure of having Dr. Abaluck. Dr. Abaluck is one of the lead authors of the most talked about, very famous, the Bangladesh mask cluster randomized control trial. He's a professor of economics at the Yale School of Management, and we are super honored to have him. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So there's been a ton of discussion more recently about the mass study, and I should congratulate you. Today, I saw someone. I saw that it was just published in Science.
Yes.
Is that correct? So congratulations. That must be. I mean, we were talking earlier about how much work this must have been to do. Really impressive effort. So there's a lot of questions about it, and you're here to kind of answer those questions and kind of lift the veil in terms of some of the decisions that were made and how you made them, and kind of how you did this. I thought just as a review, I would go through just to start, go through what I think you did.
Yes.
And then you please tell me what it is we may be getting wrong. So
okay.
You took 600 villages in Bangladesh, and they were paired. They were pair-based, based on a number of different things: COVID case data, population density, population size, also geography, because you wanted to get kind of villages that were similar, I guess. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then each paired village, once you had these pairs of villages that were about similar in terms of COVID case counts and population density, etc., each paired village was then assigned either treatment or control. Correct? And that was randomly done. The next thing that
I want to clarify one subtlety so far, because it's going to become important later, I think, which is that so initially what we randomized, so we would have unions. So a union is more like a county in Bangladesh. And what happened was, so the unions were randomized to treatment or controls. And while they were geographically proximate, they were in what's called the same upazila, which is like a state. So it's sort of like counties within the same state that you're comparing. And then we're choosing one village within each union. So we had people go and do scoping visits before, so the people doing the scoping visits who are choosing the village, they don't know if it's a treatment or control union. So they select a village within each union that is then the village that is compared. Okay. So the reason that's important is because when we do the stratification, initially we have union level population data, union level case data. We don't necessarily have data about the specific villages, and that doesn't generally exist in rural Bangladesh. Like, you can't just, it's not like you look in the phone book and you're like, oh, there's exactly 2,000 people in these villages. They're all going to have different populations. So it's like we're trying to pick unions that are similarly populous, but the villages aren't guaranteed to be identical size or anything like that.
Oh, I see. So, but wait, so you initially had a survey team go out that made sure that they were the same population or same, etc.
So we have estimates of the union level population.
Okay, you have estimates.
And then what happens is, and we said, oh, okay, so now we've paired Union A and Union B. Okay. Then we have this scoping team go out that doesn't know if the unions are treatment or control, and they're going to pick a suitable village within each union.
Okay, what are they picking the suitable village for? For the treatment arm?
Oh, good question. No, for either the treatment
or for either treatment or argument. Okay,
so they're picking the village, but the idea is, what I mean by suitable is we wanted villages that had like approximate mosque and approximate market, because we wanted to make sure that there were settings that were suitable for the intervention. Okay, so it's like, so you have the unions, then you have the villages select, like the unions are randomized, the villages are selected within each union, but not, of course, it's not like you're saying, oh, let's pick this village in the treatment area or anything like that, right?
I understand.
Okay. And then you're comparing the villages.
Okay, so I didn't know that. Yeah, so there was this initial step to try to make sure you were choosing villages that were appropriate for all the things that you wanted to do, right?
Exactly.
Okay, excellent. All right, so once those villages are picked, then they are assigned to treatment or control. Next, after that, observers are sent in to the treatment and control villages to enroll households in the study.
Correct.
And this is where what you're saying starts to matter, maybe. Observers, importantly, were not blinded to the treatment assignment in each village. So, and that's partly
right. They were blinded when they chose the initial village, but then when the people go back to enroll them, and actually this was a deliberate decision on our part, because basically we had a choice where, so there's like several rounds of household surveys that have to happen for the study to happen, and we had to go to each household and enroll the households, and then basically immediately thereafter in the treatment households we had to distribute masks. So what we had to decide was the following: do we want to have one team go and enroll the households, then the next day you go back and try to locate everyone again in the treatment places and give them masks, or do you do it all at once? In other words, have one team and instruct them, look, you do the first part and it has to be totally parallel. Pretend you don't know if it's treatment or control village. You find the people, you enroll them in the study. And then after you do that baseline survey, if it is the treatment village, you look on your iPad and you're like, oh, it's the treatment village. Now I'm going to decide to give them a mask. And the difference is basically, you know, it costs several $100,000 if we want to go back and find everyone in every household. Additionally, we were worried that there would be more attrition. It's like you go back and a lot of people won't be home that you've already reached the first time. So in light of those two, the fact that it was, you know, we have a finite amount of money for this study, and basically if you do 2 visits, then we have to cut the sample size by 100 villages or something like that. So we were like, look, you know, on the one hand, it's nice to have blinding at this initial phase when you're enrolling the people. On the other hand, as we'll discuss later, I think the opportunity for bias there, like I wouldn't say that's the first order thing that you worry about in the study. I think the unblinding did create what we'll call balance failures, but I think one can bound the bias that resulted from those balance failures. And by the way, these are not even necessarily the same people who are coming back and then doing the surveys at 5 and 9 weeks, who of course can't be blinded to whether they're not told whether it's the treatment or control village, but they can immediately infer it by the fact that mask use is far more common in the treatment village. So in other words, it's like we knew that at 5 and 9 weeks, the survey teams wouldn't be blinded anyway. So it's like, okay, you know, is that so? These are the kinds of factors.
But that's. I mean, the pros and cons. I mean, there are pros and cons. You're laying out. You're laying out why you made the. You're laying out why you made the decision to unblind. You know, pragmatic. You know, saving dollars so that you could, you know,
and also
enroll more villages, etc.
Which is so it's both the pragmatic issue about the money, and also the issue about attrition. Like there's issues, there's things that go wrong either way, and so right.
So there are downsides. There are downsides to But so anyways, so these were observers that were not blinded. They went to the treatment. They went to each village, and then if they were, you know, and they were, once they enrolled the household, they would immediately give them masks. So that they obviously knew which they were. The households. And when the households were approached by the observers, they either consented to participate, declined to participate, or were marked unreachable by the unblinded observers. The study team, you know, then you guys proceeded to implement a mask promotion intervention in the treatment villages, and this was actually a variety of different things in different villages. You know, because of the size, you were able to do a number of different things. Cricket players were involved and whatnot. So
well, the cricket players weren't in the village. There were videos of the cricket players.
Right. Yes, yeah. And then finally, in both villages, participants were asked to report COVID-like symptoms, and that was done by a phone survey, correct?
So that's a good question. It was actually so most of them, it's actually a follow-up household survey. So what we had initially planned to do was at weeks 5 and 9, we had planned, when we initially designed the study, we were like, okay, we're going to do this initial household visit, then we're going to do phone surveys at weeks 5 and 9. We started to do the phone survey for the first couple of villages in week 5, and what we found, without unblinding ourselves to whether it was treatment or control, was actually that there was like issues with like responsiveness, and there were issues where when you just like looked at the data, you'd see that like people would just report like they would answer questions in ways that seemed like they weren't taking it seriously. Like there were funny inconsistencies and stuff. So we said, okay, we're not going to get good data if we stick with the phone survey plan. We need to actually go to the households if we want people to pay attention to the questions that we're asking. So actually, most of the data that ends up being collected at weeks 5 and 9, and it's not a difference between treatment and control, whether it's phone or household, because like we did in like waves. So it's like there were a couple pairs where it was phone surveys, but then the vast majority of it actually ends up being household surveys, where we send people to see the households again. We then, during that visit to the household, ask them a bunch of questions that includes like symptom recall questions. And to be clear, it's not like, one might get the impression from describing this that it's like, oh, you know, people are coming wearing the mask uniforms and everyone's like, oh, these are the people giving out the masks or everything like that. It's not like that. It's like, and in this study, people are kind of, another thing you might not realize is like in these kinds of villages, there's activities from NGOs, from non-governmental organization a lot. So it's not like people are like, oh, there's this crazy thing going on. There's someone coming to our house and asking us questions. It's like things like that have happened before. So it's not like unusual. It's not necessarily that people are like, oh, this is the mask thing. That's what's happening. It's like someone's coming to their house and like, hey, we want to ask you questions about COVID. And like, yeah, okay. People ask this question about, or like and actually, I don't think they even say that. I think that they're like, initially when we come to the house, we're like, hey, it's like, we're from this NGO called Green Voice that has done previous work in the village, and we're like, hey, can we ask you some questions? Like, yes. And then it's like they go through, and among the questions they ask them then, and they're not even like, hey, do you have COVID symptoms? They're like, oh, we want to ask you a couple questions about like whether you've been healthy over the past couple of weeks. So for example, I'm going to go through a list of symptoms. Have you had, you know, watery eyes? Have you had this and that? And they go through a bunch of symptoms, and then there's a particular constellation of those symptoms that meets the WHO surveillance definition of COVID.
Right. Okay. All right. Excellent. So that's fascinating. So you tried the phone surveys. You're getting answers that were somewhat gobbledygook, or, you know, people not paying attention. So then you actually had to send out people to all these different households to try to in person do a survey to figure out. And again, the folks that are going out doing the surveys, they know that they're not blinded.
Yeah, I mean, so here's what I would say. They're actually, like, officially they're blinded, but obviously in practice they can't be blinded, right? Because it's like we don't tell them if it's a treatment or control village, but as soon as they get to the village, if they look around, they can probably see how many people are wearing masks. So I wouldn't say like they're blinded or something like that.
Right. The part about where, so you did not specifically tell them. But it's the same group of people. I mean, how many people were doing the study? How many you must know? I mean, approximately how many?
It's not. In most cases, it's not the same surveyor who is at the baseline thing. So there's hundreds of people who were employed in this project overall. The reason it's not the same surveyor is because it's like, so the people who did the household survey aren't the same as the people handing out the masks or anything like that. We wanted to separate those. And remember, the household surveys are like 5 weeks apart. So you can't like employ people for 5 weeks for one day every 5 weeks or whatever. So it's like it's not that there was one person for one village either. It's like people went around to, it's like the surveyors are doing multiple village, but they're also not necessarily traveling across the whole country. They're doing in a given location. So it's often at 5 weeks, it's going to be a different person than the person who came to your house at baseline.
I see. How many, so you're saying hundreds, so it took hundreds of people to implement this study?
Oh yeah.
Thousands or hundreds?
Hundreds, I would say,
hundreds of people.
Of employees. Yeah, and actually if you include, I'm trying to think if it's thousands, if you include the people doing, so we're talking about the surveyors. Then there's the people who do what we call the mask reinforcement, which is a part of the intervention, and it turns out a critical part of the intervention, in my view, is that in the treatment villages, you have these people in crowded public areas, in markets, in mosques, and in other locations like tea stalls, who are going up to people if they see them not wearing a mask, and they're like, hey, can you please put on a mask? Remember, we're all trying to wear a mask to keep everyone safe, etc. And in fact, my view, and I can explain the evidence for this, is that that's maybe the most essential part of the intervention. Those people doing mass reinforcement.
Right. That's a good point to clarify, I think, because what is the question that you were trying to answer the study, right? So let's start maybe at the beginning, right?
Everyone had already read our 90-page study. I didn't realize that there might be people listening who hadn't read all 90 pages, but I guess we could talk about what the study is trying to do. So we randomized these villages to have this intense intervention designed to increase mask uptake. There's really two main purposes of the study. The first is how do you get people to wear masks? The second is, can we measure the impact of masks on COVID defined as symptomatic SARS-CoV-2?
So here, I mean, can you clarify, because can you conclude on the effectiveness of masks versus the effectiveness of your intervention, or how do you tease that out?
That's a very good question. So the randomization itself only identifies the effectiveness of the intervention. That's always true of randomization. It's even true for something like vaccines. There's a similar worry, although I don't think it's serious. Like you might say, oh, we have vaccines, and even in the placebo group, it's like it could be that people get the vaccine, and of course they feel sick and their arm hurts, so they realize that they got the vaccine. And in light of that, maybe they stay home because they felt a little bit ill. And maybe it's that social distancing that leads to the impact of the vaccine and not the biological impact. And it's like, you can't disentangle that from the randomization itself. You always need sort of like further analyses and assumptions to disentangle whether it's the direct effect. And in our setting, the question is it the direct effect of the masking, or is it some other behavior change that happened as a result of the intervention? The most relevant that we measure is probably physical distancing. So to spoil the results, since we started by diving into the protocol in great detail, what we find is we do this intervention. It increases mask use by about 30 percentage points. It increases what we call physical distancing by about 5 percentage points. So both mask use and physical distancing are measured by direct observation. They're measured by people going to the village in plain clothes, like they're like concealed, but people in these public areas who are observing and counting. So we can see like whether people are one arm's length apart. We can see if they're wearing masks. We also, by the way, measure what we call social distancing, which is like how many people are there total. We don't see a change in social distancing, but we see these changes in mask wearing and physical distancing. And so that then raises the question you raised at the outset, which is a very good question, which is basically, okay, we do the intervention. How can we separately identify the impact of mask use from the impact of physical distancing? So point one, which I already noted, is you can't just from the randomization. So what kinds of things can you do to try to disentangle?
But also, isn't there also the question of, can you disentangle the question of mask use versus the question of mask use in the context of all the encouragement that you've made? I mean, I guess you have the mask utilization, right?
Yes.
That you can control, right? You can use that to control for the effect of the actual mask. But
I wouldn't use the phrase control for. The way that I would put it is as follows. Like that's where I was going, which is that we do have the evidence on the actual mask utilization. So the randomization just says, here's what the intervention did relative to no intervention. Mm-hmm. Then you can do a further analysis that requires additional assumptions beyond the assumption of randomization. You can say, look, let's look across villages. Let's see how much mask use varied. Let's see how much whatever else we're worried about varied. So for example, physical distancing. So is it the case that when you see a decline in symptoms or a decline in symptomatic seropositivity, is it that you see, for example, a greater decline in the villages that have a greater increase in mask use? Or is it that you see a decline in the villages where people physically distance more? When we do that analysis, what we find is, well, when you include mask use and physical distancing in the model, mask use is what explains the decline in symptoms and symptomatic seropositivity. Now, let me explain what it means that that's not random and what the nature of the caveat is. Okay, so first of all, and it shouldn't be shocking because it's like we see a much bigger change in mask behavior than physical distancing, and the whole intervention was designed to change mask behavior. So it wasn't all that surprising that we found this. The caveat is, because it's non-random, whenever you do a non-random analysis, you always have to ask, there's always one critical question. It's like, why is it that this thing varied across villages? And in our case, it would be, why is it that mask use increased by more in some treatment villages than others? So here is what we could have found with the non-random data. You might have found, oh, in the villages where the mask use increased by more, actually, everyone was way sicker, because the reason that mask use increased by more in some treatment villages is there was a COVID outbreak and everyone was worried about COVID. So you easily could have found that. It wouldn't have shown that masks make you sicker. It just would have been that there was this compound, right? And that's a compound that exists whenever the variation in mask use is not random. Now, what you hope is the case for the purposes of the exercise I just described to you is that, well, the reason that mask use increased by more in some villages than others is, the promoter was a little bit more enthusiastic. They managed to get a couple more people to wear masks. It's not because they were sicker or healthier. It's just, the intervention was a little more intensive. And that's consistent with the evidence we found, which is that, we don't find that where mask use increased by more, if it's sicker, we find where mask use increased by more, they actually ended up getting healthier relative to baseline. So it's like, okay, I mean, that's suggestive that the mechanism is about the filtration effect of the mask rather than physical distancing. But again, that's not something that in principle can ever be proven by randomization. It's something that always requires these auxiliary analyses.
So those are the kind of the top line results and some of the analysis you did. So this is where I started to have questions when you actually were tweeting about this. September 1st is when I first, or so around there, early September is when this first, I guess, started coming out.
Yep.
And just to be clear, the primary endpoint is was symptomatic seropositivity. You
Yes.
also were measuring for symptoms.
That's fair. Although I want to make one important qualification here, which is that is the primary endpoint, and that's what we powered the study for.
Yep.
I think it's very important when understanding the study results not to just look at that one endpoint, because there's a lot going on. We have results for a lot of outcomes. We have results for symptoms, symptomatic seropositivity. I think to understand the results, you don't look at that one thing, because my interpretation of the study would have been very different had the results for that primary endpoint been identical, but the secondary endpoint shown something different. So it's like when I tell you what I think the study means, it's not because it's like I'm looking just at that primary endpoint. It's because I'm looking at the whole constellation of results in light of what that primary endpoint says. And I'll be more specific later, obviously.
Okay. And so so the primary endpoint is evaluated based on the number of these blood draws that tested positive for COVID antibodies, right? So so I'm just going to go through some numbers. The number of people that consented to baseline household visits in the treatment village arm was 178,322. Control village was 163,861. That's a difference. That's a difference of about 15,000 in the two.
So there are several factors that contribute to this.
Right. Some
innocuous and some like somewhat problematic, but that generate bias that we can bound.
Right. So there was. So I mean, and you've talked about this, right? So despite the fact that there was this randomization, 300 villages to each, 300 villages in one, 300 villages in the other. There's and this is where, and again, you've mentioned why this is. It's not like you can look at a phone book in Bangladesh and, that's why you guys scoped out villages and stuff. And it was always going to be expected that the numbers were not going to be exactly the same because villages are different sized and stuff, right?
Exactly.
But whatever. So it so happened that that the imbalance in size of the consenting population and the control and treatment arm were, fairly markedly different.
And to be clear, I don't think that entire imbalance is random. I think there is, we can go through the different causes of it. I think part of it is actually just the way the draw worked out in the population size of the villages. I think there is like an actual imbalance caused by like the baseline surveyors being slightly more enthusiastic or like something like that. Well, in like searching out more households in the treatment villages. And the key thing to recognize is that you don't just look at that and you say, oh, what's the T-stat here? That the T-stat on any kind of imbalance like this is the starting point. You then have to investigate and ask, what would it mean for the results? And you can do all kinds of bounding exercises. Like you can say, for example, what would it mean for the results if, when we look at the differential consent rate, if every single additional person in the treatment villages who consented were perfectly healthy? Like that would maximize the amount of bias in the treatment villages.
Right.
And basically what you find is, 2.5 percentage points more people consented it's like the consent rate is like 92%. It's like 92% in the control villages, like 94.5% in the treatment villages. And so basically what that means is like, well, if all of them were perfectly healthy, you would have a bias in the treatment prevalence where it would be about 3% lower because you would be adding a bunch of perfectly healthy people.
No,
the
yeah.
reason-
Right.
Oh yeah. Okay.
No, go ahead. No,
Yeah.
yeah. So no, just I don't. So yeah. So you have an imbalance in how many people you have in the treatment and control arm. In this particular case, the control group has about 14,000 fewer individuals in the treatment group, right? And so then, and I'm going to get to, we'll rehash this a couple of times, but then we want to look at, okay, what were the number of symptomatic seropositives in the treatment group, and what were the number of treatment symptom positives in the control? Now, the one interesting thing is you have this beautiful table, right, from the preprint that actually I don't think made it to Science. I don't think it's table S1, the enrollment and consent, where you nicely show number of people consented, number of people reached, number of people with symptoms, number of blood samples collected.
In Science is like, all of the appendices are in the online appendices. So
right. Sorry. Right. But I'm curious why. What was the decision? Why wouldn't you put down so there were 1,086 symptomatic seropositives in the treatment arm, and 1,106, so more in the control arm. So there were 20 more symptomatic seropositive cases that were found in the control group over the course of that 8-week period. What was the decision about leaving that out of the original preprint? I'm sure.
I think it is, I'm not sure that it's. There's no decision to leave it out.
Oh, okay.
It's like I think there's like what is certainly true is that I think those explicit numbers are in there if we look at the right table. But I would also say what is certainly true is you could complete them. It's not just that they're in there. It's like if you multiply the two numbers in our abstract, you could immediately compute them. So this is not. We're not hiding.
So the point. Yeah. So the 0.69%. It was confusing, but for me it was confusing because when I September 5th or something like that, I was looking at it. I was like, okay, you had 0.69% and 0.76%, right?
Right.
So those numbers, you're saying if you just took 0.069 and multiplied it by the total number in the treatment and 0.076 and multiply the total number in control, you would get these numbers. That's what you're saying, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And then, so there's this 20 case difference, and then, but in the discussion you say that, but that 20 case difference is only of those 5,000.
Let me just be careful because I want to make sure that readers are multiplying the right things or whatever. They have to make sure that there's different types of numbers that are reported. There are regression adjusted numbers and there are raw rates. So if you want to get the raw numbers back, you need to make sure you're not using the regression adjusted prevalence numbers. Anyway.
Okay.
But
I understand.
This is going to make a difference of like 10 people. It's not like
right. Yeah. All right. So but regardless, so you went from this 20 case difference, right? That comes out, and you somehow then go to 105 in the entire 300,000 group. How do you go from that 20 case to the 105? How does that happen? Yeah.
So the key thing that the question is, what is actually the outcome that we are looking at? So I think the fundamental question you're asking is, should the outcome be the prevalence of symptomatic seropositivity? In other words, the percent of people who have COVID, or should the outcome be the number of people who have COVID, and how do you decide between those? So I think it's easiest to explain the reasoning in a couple of steps. So
you're saying I'm focused. I'm asking about the raw numbers, and you're saying, look, and I've read your response. Your response is that look, we have different numbers of people in the treatment and control arm. Why would you use the raw number? It's better to use the
it's a little
positive
subtler.
rates.
It's actually a little subtler than that, but the first explanation, that's sort of like the partially correct but incomplete explanation, and then I'll get to the fuller explanation. So the first point is, just what is the difference between prevalence and raw rates, right? And you're like, look, if you just want to understand, hey, you have two groups of people. Do more people have COVID? Is there more COVID in one group of people than the other? If those groups were different sizes, obviously it's natural to compute the prevalence, right? Like if you have one group where you're like, hey, 500 people out of 1,200 have COVID, and in the second group, 500 people out of 1,000 have COVID, you wouldn't say, oh, there's the same amount of COVID because there's 500 in each. You would compute the prevalence. Now, the problem with that is that's an incomplete explanation. What that explanation overlooks is like, it's like, oh, well, but if the randomization probabilities were 50-50, shouldn't the populations be perfectly balanced such that it's valid to compare the counts? And it is valid to compare the counts. It's also valid to compare the prevalences. So there's another way of putting this is, in a randomized experiment, there are many estimators, many unbiased estimators of the treatment effect that have very different finite sample properties, but are all unbiased. They're all valid under the hypothesis of randomization. So then the question is, how do you choose between these finite sample estimators? Why would you compute the prevalence? Why would you compare the counts or something like that? And what statisticians do is they compute something called efficiency. They ask, how powerful is a given estimate? So you don't just choose the estimate that is unbiased. You don't just say all the unbiased estimates are equal. You say, what unbiased estimates minimize the variance? That's actually a subtle question, and it depends. There's lots of different modeling that can go into trying to assess that. In a case like this, where the population is unknown and potentially varies a lot across villages, it is actually potentially much lower variance to use prevalence than to use raw numbers. So
how do you calculate prevalence if you don't know raw numbers? Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like you calculate the prevalence given the raw numbers, right? But so first, before we look at any results, let's just talk about, before we did anything in the trial, we're just designing the trial now. We're just like, hey, what are we going to pre-register as our primary outcome? How do we decide between prevalence and raw counts? Because, this is a conversation you have to have. But, this is a big deal. Like this trial, it's like millions of dollars that we're spending in total. So we want to make sure we get this decision right. So we do a lot of calculations, right? We do a bunch of simulations where we look at what are the properties of raw counts and what are the properties of prevalence numbers before we even look at the data, right? So this isn't something where it's like I'm looking at the data and I'm cherry picking the thing I like because it gives me the number I like, right? I haven't looked at the data yet. We're doing these calculations. We're deciding what should we pre-register. And what we determined was that due to the likely variance in populations across village in our simulations, the estimator based on the raw counts would be much more inefficient than the estimator based on the prevalences, because there would just by chance be variation in population across villages. And if you didn't use the prevalence estimator, you would be losing out because of that, because the counts would then be artificially variable due to the variation in population. So that is what led us to pre-register the prevalence estimator. Now, you're right in a sense. Ideally, what would happen is you run every single possible estimator. It doesn't matter. It gives you have a p-value of 0.00001 and a t-stat of 1,000, and then you're like, great, who cares, right? Like none of these decisions matter. But of course, we knew that these decisions would matter because, when we power the study, we're not like, oh, give us, like if we had had infinite money, I would have been like, oh yeah, give me $1 billion and we'll be able to do a study where we'll have a t-stat of 20 no matter what. But that's not what happens. We have to figure out, look, given the likely effectiveness of mass, given assumptions about, the likely number of seroconversions and everything else, like how many villages do you choose? And we're powering it for like the range of values of mask effectiveness that we see in the observational literature. Now, in fact, while I think our results do show effectiveness, I actually think they're kind of on the lower end of what the non-experimental literature suggested in terms of that effectiveness, which is why, the power for the symptomatic seropositivity outcome, it really becomes essential that we pre-registered the most efficient outcome and you don't just use these other estimators that introduce a lot of.
But I'm still not, what I still don't follow though, Jason, is how in order to do rates, to get rates done appropriately, right? I mean, yes. Look, your little hypothetical was beautiful for the audience, right? Meaning, if you have 500 cases in one group and you have 500 in the other, right? Using raw counts is stupid if you don't consider the denominator, right? So if you have 500 out of 1,000 versus 500 out of 10,000, there obviously you have to consider the denominator in that case, right? And so that's why you would like to use rates, right? Rates are important. So, right. But the problem is, as you outlined earlier on, is that Bangladesh doesn't have a some phone book or some Google
Oh,
thing
right.
where
So
you know exactly
the
how many.
denominator is,
So,
yeah.
right. So the denominator. So the problem here is that in the control villages, right? You have your seropositive rate in control villages is 1106 out of 156,938, right? In your treatment arm, it's 1086 out of 170,497, right?
Okay. Yep.
So the issue is, you know,
I'm taking your word. I don't remember these.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, well, I'm close. Maybe off phone. But the issue then becomes you have no idea what in the control, that denominator being 156,938. Maybe in those villages, right? Maybe that number is 180,000, right? And maybe.
Oh, okay. No.
No.
So that's a misunderstanding, because so it is true that is the number. Like the denominator is correct for the purposes of the analysis, because the denominator is the number of people that we surveyed who could possibly be sick.
No, but that's not. But you're doing an intervention in a village. I mean, obviously the entire village is affected, right? So if you say you contacted 80, and you don't know, say you contacted 80% of the village, and that's what this number is you're representing. There are 20% of other people in the village that are also being impacted that you don't know about, right?
Yeah. So how is that? This is a subtle point. So it's very important. So first, but before. And you're right, it becomes especially complicated because of this balance failure that I told you about before, where actually the consent rate did end up being, you know, higher by like a little more than 2 percentage points in the treatment group. So let's analyze one thing at a time, and then we'll explain how they all fit together. Okay, so first pretend that there was no imbalance of that nature. Okay, so pretend that, you know, the surveyors have been fully blinded. You know, we discussed earlier the reasons why we didn't necessarily want to do that, but pretend.
So we should clarify before you go on. We should clarify that the most likely reason that I think everyone agrees on in terms of why there's 15,000 or so more folks in the treatment group that were enrolled was probably because the surveyors went out with masks and were more. That's not a fair assumption. Oh, that's a part.
That's a part of it. That's not. That doesn't explain the 15,000. That explains.
Okay, sorry. It's an important part of it that meant that they were perhaps more motivated.
But it's actually important that it's not like.
Not the whole thing.
Or something. But
how the heck do you estimate what? How do you know how? You have some way of estimating?
Yes, you can estimate, and not just estimate, but you can actually.
Is there anything econometrics cannot answer? No, you're like no. We can answer everything.
But it's important. I just want to clarify that the claim I was making wasn't based on like some model with lots of complicated additional assumptions. It's something you can just calculate. But tell me about the denominators first. Tell me because these denominators are really important, right? First, put aside the balance value. Pretend there were no balance value. Okay.
There's no imbalances.
There's no imbalances.
Okay.
However, what would happen is just by chance, you know, you end up the treatment villages, you end up surveying more people due to randomness. It ends up being the treatment villages are a little bit bigger. So what ends up happening is in the treatment villages, you survey, you know, 160,000, and in the control village, you survey 150,000, right? And what the reasoning that I was explaining before was that it is then more efficient to pre-register that what you are going to do to analyze things is, instead of just comparing the raw counts, you're going to take the counts, divide them by the number of people that you managed to reach, and then you're going to compare the preferences. Okay.
How does pre-registration? But that's like cheating.
Oh no, it's the opposite. It's the exact opposite of cheating.
But if you pre-register, right. But you're pre-registering. I see what you're saying, because you don't know treatment control. I understand what you're saying. Cheating is the wrong word. I just mean that if you're pre-registering that you can't reach everyone, it's like you're automatically pre-registering this.
Well, okay, hold on.
You know what I mean?
It's not even that you're pre-registering that you can't reach everyone, because remember, even if you, so first, let's go in smaller steps. First, imagine you reach 100% of the people in every village. Yeah. You still have the same issue, that the village just ends up being bigger by chance in the treatment or the control regions. You don't know which one.
Yeah.
Right. Sure, so even if you reach 100%, you still get this benefit that I'm talking about from prevalence.
Right.
Then there's the issue you said, which is due purely to random chance, you have blinding or whatever, you might reach a slightly different percent in the two villages. So again, you want to do the prevalence increases power. So again, the key thing to recognize is that all of these estimators are in principle unbiased. All of these estimators, as long as you're not like conditioning on treatment somehow in deciding which of these things to use, you can use the prevalence, you can use the counts, all of those are unbiased. They have different efficiency properties. They have different properties in terms of how big do you expect the standard errors to be, or like, you know, how big a sample do you need to reach a certain level of power.
Okay, so you're not, so but were you concerned at all that the difference in rates, right, that you got right here, we're getting a raw, is it fair to do that? I mean, so we get a 0.7% seropositivity rate in the control, 0.63% in the treatment arm. But that's a pretty big difference, right? I mean, if you're doing, you know, that's a reasonable effect size, or perhaps for something like that.
10% decline, isn't it?
Yeah, 10% decline, right? Exactly, around a 10% decline. But are you worried about the fact that it is largely driven by this? When the numerator is so small, are you worried?
So let me tell you where I am and where I'm not worried. So if there were no balance failure, then I wouldn't be worried in the slightest, because there would be no, like, if there's no balance failure, there's no, like,
explain what do you mean by balance failure? What do you mean by balance failure? If there's no balance.
What I mean by the balance failure is, I mean, like, were the things that were supposed to be random actually random? So we talked earlier about the issue that it's like, oh, you know, the unblinded surveyors may have actually like been more enthusiastic. You know, they waited a little longer after they knocked on doors because they were like, hey, I bet it would be good if we gave these people masks at the end after we do their survey, things like that. And so they ended up, you know, enrolling a couple percentage points more people in the treatment group. That is a balance failure. That is another complication that we need to layer on top of all the other analyses to correct for, okay? But if it weren't for that balance failure, then the answer is no, I would not worry in the slightest. We would be doing a completely statistically valid procedure that just has more efficiency, that is just a better way of estimating, of looking for the effect of the intervention.
Okay. But I mean, don't you think that, sorry, even if it is, as you said here, doesn't it worry you that just by virtue of the fact that the numbers are so small, that if you were to repeat the experiment all over again, I mean, what would the chance be that, I mean, so I accept the fact that the rates are more efficient and more stable, they have less variance. But nevertheless, I mean, it seems to me intuitively, I know nothing about statistics, that if the numbers are very small, the chance of getting a different outcome if you repeated the experiment would be low.
First, I have good news for you. We are repeating the experiment. so there are two things to think about when you repeat the experiment. There is what's called external validity and what's called internal validity. So suppose we actually literally did exactly the same experiment and everything were identical. In other words, you know, if we could somehow do the experiment again in March of 2021, we had exactly the same COVID rates,
right?
You know,
and make the same mistakes, meaning you don't learn anything. You make the same mistakes. They're exactly the same steps.
Right? But suppose we were to do the experiment again, but like in statistics, we call this, it's like you have a data generating process and you take another draw from the data generating process. So like, in what sense should you be worried about these small numbers? And the answer is that is exactly what the confidence intervals and the p-values and the standard errors are quantifying. Okay, so those, if you have calculated those correctly using the correct formulas, given that we're doing prevalence and everything else, then the answer is those are quantifying exactly. And we can talk about, they're quantifying different things. I'm just mentioning things that are all related to the concern that you had. And like the confidence interval is basically, the way to think about the confidence interval is saying like, look, you've constructed an interval such that if you were to keep redoing the experiment over and over and over, the interval constructed in the way that we did would 95% of the time contain the true value.
Let me ask you this, because I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's with the confidence intervals, if you had done the analysis using the raw numbers as the primary endpoint, wouldn't it be wider?
Oh yeah, much wider, and that's why we didn't.
Okay.
Yeah, but again, not only would they have been wider before we did the study, I could have told you they'd be much wider.
Right.
And that's why that's a mistake.
That's why you chose the prevalence as a,
That's why,
right.
because, and again, like we chose the prevalence because you're getting more precise estimates of the quantity that you want to estimate, which is like the reduction in COVID masking, right? So it's like, this is not, I don't want it to like sound to your audience like, oh, we're doing some trick or something like that. Like it was a very, very deliberate choice, the way that any person running trials who designs this kind of thing would do it, to maximize efficiency, subject to having bias, by choosing prevalence rather than the other thing.
But this is where the issues, when you have this 20 case difference, this is where the issues of, where we talked earlier about the pros and cons of, having blinded surveyors or not, right?
Yeah,
and then the difficulties of it, of course, the pragmatic difficulties of somebody going to a mask intervention village and looking around and whatnot. But you also have, it is one of the reasons we love blinding is that you don't want the person writing down something to be biased towards that. So it's possible that the reason that mask wearing went up 29% in the treatment villages, it's possible that it's because they weren't blinded and they want the treatment to work. That's a possibility, right?
I don't think it's a serious possibility for a variety of reasons.
That's why we have you on. Please tell me why.
The mask wearing is 29%. Like, first of all, it's like, I'm not saying that the entire uptick is completely wrong. I'm saying there's that maybe who knows. It's possible there's a small amount of bias, but like I'd be shocked if in terms of mask wearing it was more than a few percentage points in there. So there's a variety of things we do, like there's inner surveyor reliability tests. We have multiple surveyors do the same thing and play. Like there's all kinds of testing you do to try to.
So it's not just one person out there. You have multiple people doing the same thing, and then you compare them.
Usually it is one person per location, but you do tests where you have multiple people per location in order to in order to check the rate of reliability.
Okay, so you have some internal validity.
Some where you do.
Okay. All right.
But there was another, I think, critical point, which I had mentioned earlier, which is really important to understand now, which is this point that I said where I was like, look, if I were to look at the results for the primary outcome in isolation, I would interpret them very differently. Where some of the secondary outcome differences, results different. And because like what you're fundamentally getting at with your question is, we did this prevalence thing, and it's like we have this estimate, but it has a reasonably big confidence interval, right? So it's like you see this confidence interval in prevalence, and it's like the point estimate might be a 10% reduction in prevalence. But like statistically, can we rule out? Can we say definitively there's no way there was a 4% reduction? No, we can't. Can we say there's no way there was, a 16% reduction? No, we can't. Like the confidence interval is pretty big here. So those are all possible values for the reduction in symptomatic seropositivity. Now, the reason I interpret the results of the trial the way I do is not just because I'm looking at the primary outcome and then I'm throwing out the rest of the data. I'm like, guys, we got our primary outcome, let's go home. It's because we have all these other results on other outcomes that are much more precise, right? That allow us to understand and to give an overall narrative about what we think is going on. So let me go through those a little bit. Like, it's like we also see a much more precise 10% reduction in symptoms. Okay, so you see this reduction in symptoms. Now, again, the balance value we still need to get to. It's like that can bias anything. We need to try to figure out how big the bias is. Put aside the balance value for a moment. Okay, so we'll come back to that and we'll talk about how big any bias might be from that. You have this 10% reduction in symptoms. And then what you need to say is like, look, that could actually mean several different things. The reason we did this blood testing is because we know that the symptoms of COVID are non-specific. So the fact that you saw less COVID in the treatment group might just be because it's like, it was influenza or something, and that was reduced. So that's why you do this blood testing. Now, there's actually an intermediate outcome between symptoms and symptomatic seropositivity. And the key question here is, how do you deal with the non-consenters to the blood test? So we have all these people who are symptomatic, okay? And we go to them at end line at 10 weeks into the trial, and we're like, hey, can we collect your blood? Most of them say no. 60% of them say no. 40% of them say yes. And it is not surprising because it's like, Who wants to have their arm poked to get blood collected, right? So it's like we totally anticipated this in our power calculations. We were like, yeah, we're going to have this high non-consent rate. That's why we powered it the way we did, right? So, but it's like, okay, you have this 40% consent rate. First question is that balanced? Because you'd worry a lot. You'd be like, hey, if you collected blood from all different people in the treatment group, that's a problem. The good news is that is balanced, okay? So you saw people were about equally likely, 40% likely to consent between the treatment and the control group. So for the people for whom you have the symptomatic, the blood that you've collected, you can then compute symptomatic seropositivity. Were they symptomatic? And we saw antibodies. But the key question is, what in the world do you do for all the people who didn't consent to give blood? In our baseline results, the results we talked about, where we have this outcome of like 0.7% of the population or whatever, we're actually dropping all those people. So this estimate of 0.7% is a considerable underestimate of the actual symptomatic seroprevalence in the population. The actual symptomatic seroprevalence is about 2.5 times higher. So it's close to like 2%, something like that, rather than 0.7%. But for all that 60% of people who gave the symptom data, we don't have their blood results. So there's a number of assumptions you could make there. The assumption we used in our primary outcome was to drop them because we felt that was the most conservative. Another thing you can do is to say, well, suppose you take all the people who are missing the blood collection data. For the people you have it, you use it. For the other people, you just assume that there would be equal rates of seropositivity conditional on being symptomatic between the treatment and control groups. Okay, what might justify that assumption? It's kind of a subtle point, actually. That assumption would be valid if it were the case that masks had an equal proportional impact on COVID and non-COVID causes of COVID symptoms. So if masks had an equal proportional impact on COVID and non-COVID causes of COVID symptoms, then you would expect that in the treatment and control groups, there would be equal conditional seropositivity. If we do that exercise, then we have like, you impute things in that way, you get like a t-stat of 4 or something like that. So you get much more precise estimates. And again, you get this 10% drop. And actually it's a little bigger, it's like a 12% drop. Okay, so you have that exercise. You have the symptoms, you have that exercise. Then you have our most conservative of all exercise, the exercise where we're like, we have only symptomatic seropositivity, where we're looking only at the people who were symptomatic, that's already 7 or 8% of the population. Then they consented to give blood. We dropped 60% of them. Then they happened to be, then they were seropositive. So we could see that they had COVID antibodies. So then you're dropping another like 3/4 of them. And at the end of the day, you get these relatively small numbers, which is exactly what we knew would happen, which is exactly why we powered the trial as we did with this many villages and this many people. So it's not like, it's like, oh, shock, we're hiding, we're trying to trick everyone, we have these small numbers. It's like, that's how trials like this work. That's why it was hard, and that's why it took millions of dollars to do a study like this, right? You just had to do that in order to detect anything. But the key point is, you don't look just at this outcome where you're like, oh, there's these small counts and everything is so sensitive if we do counts of prevalence. Because if you only had that, then you guys are right. Like, you'd be like, okay, at least we pre-registered it. So yeah, it suggests something, but you definitely have to worry a little bit. What gives me much more confidence is that we don't just have that. We have the symptoms, we have this, this other way of imputing symptomatic seropositivity, where it's like, okay, this way you get more power. We have the analysis I told you about earlier, where you look at the cross-sectional variation across villages. The village where mask use increased by more, you see the reduction in COVID. So it's the entire constellation of results that causes me to draw the conclusion I do, not just this one bottom line thing where, the confidence interval is pretty big. I don't know, like, if that's all we had, then I'd be like, yeah, there's really a lot of uncertainty about the effect size. I mean, there still is uncertainty, but it's like, it's not the same way that it would be if it's like, oh, there's just that one thing and that's all there is.
No, it's interesting. And again, what you're talking about is what all critical thinking people do. Like, I was just this morning discussing with somebody about the molnupiravir, the antiviral from Merck for COVID. And the bottom line treatment is that, it's only an absolute reduction of 3% of hospitalizations. And we're talking, should we use it? Should we not use it? And then there's this other slide that looks at a secondary endpoint, which was what percentage of people end up needing oxygen in the placebo who get hospitalized. And in the molnupiravir group, 50% who get hospitalized need oxygen, whereas in the placebo group, 90% who get hospitalized need oxygen. So, like you're saying, the primary endpoint needs context, especially in some of these things. So
exactly.
I understand. I get that. This it is a little it is harder to because of course a lot of the stuff that you're doing is a little opaque to the average person who's reading this stuff, right? Like we don't know that you're doing a bunch of different things. We just kind of have to be like, well, we just, Jason's a good guy. We have to take his word for it that all these different things behind the scenes are making sense.
There's a pretty fundamental problem about the world, right? Like there's lots of things that, they're legible only to experts. Then people have to decide which experts to defer to. And there's this really hard meta question of who you should trust.
But it's not right. But these are all you would acknowledge. I mean, these are all limitations. I mean, you're doing your best in good faith to try to make sure that this is as robust of a finding as you can. But, it's an obvious critique from of the trial to say that, hey, numbers are small, lack of blinding, etc. Well, these are all things that I
think there's two, and I think it's important to think of them separately. Like, I think the numbers are small is like totally correct, and that is what the confidence interval is about. Like that.
Right.
Those
so getting to the confidence.
Quantifying that.
So getting to the confidence interval, which is and I didn't know this 5 years ago. I waddled into some confidence interval debate with some statisticians, and I went back to where I came from with my tail between my legs. Like, holy crap! I'm like, I'm never going to try to explain
confidence interval that's random. It's not.
I'm never going to try to explain confidence interval again, because however way I try to do it, there's going to be some statistician that's going to call me a moron. So I've given up. but getting to the next piece that I thought was, again, interesting, and we've all learned so much from this trial, is it the case that the statistical significance of the results, the statistical significance of the results, because is it dependent on the type of statistical model used? So, and I'm going to quote, because again, me and Michelle are Luddites here. I'm going to quote Dr. Xiao Wang, who's a senior lecturer. I don't know if you know him.
No.
He's a lecturer in health and social care statistics at the Kingston University of St. George's, University of London. He's a PhD in econometrics. Yes. Neither of us, you could tell very early on that Michelle and I do not have a PhD in econometrics. So he says,
actually, you guys seem reasonably sophisticated.
as for the primary outcome analysis, symptomatic seroprevalence, I'm quoting him, they used cluster robust standard errors, which I don't think was explicitly specified in their analysis plan. For clustered RCTs, it is more often used.
It was.
Okay.
But
yeah. Good. Well, that's why you're here. That's why you're here. No, good. So for clustered, so he said I don't think. As a good caveat. For clustered RCT, it is more often to use a random effects model. Then he has a link to a textbook of cluster, how to do cluster random, whatever. So then he says, so I ran the random effects models and compared them to what was reported, table A6 in the paper. Now the results have become statistically insignificant, even for surgical masks. Next, for risk ratios, I used a Poisson regression as with the original paper, but with random effects for clusters. The results are below, and he has tables out there. Again, the effects, including surgical masks, have become statistically insignificant. So, so how do you choose one model over the other? What makes one model right, the other wrong?
There's a number of things. There's one key thing that I am unsure of in what he's saying, and then I'll tell you how to adjudicate between these different things. The one key thing is when he says the results have become statistically insignificant, right? That is an arbitrary and silly standard. So in other words, this is like, you've probably talked to sophisticated people who are like, it doesn't really matter if a p-value is 0.05 or 0.051 or 0.049, right? So the p-value that we computed for the primary outcome was 0.043. If what he's saying is he uses this alternative model and the p-value is 0.052, it's like, his statement might be literally correct. It's no longer statistically significant at the 5% level, but it's essentially identical results. There's no difference between.
We endorse that point of view.
Yeah, there's no difference between 0.043 and 0.05. So that might be what he is saying. Okay, I'd have to obviously look at his results to understand. So that would be consistent with the literal phrasing of what you just
we endorse that point of view with a caveat that I'll come back to later. So
okay. No, the key question though, like I don't think if he did those analyses correctly that it should make much of a difference. Like it wouldn't shock me at all if the p-value went from 0.043 to 0.071. if the p-value went from 0.043 to like, you know, 0.2, then I'd be like, wait, that's weird. There's something amiss here, right? So I don't think that it should change that much. Now, again, though, this is why you pre-register, because for these kinds of statistical models, like I actually think we clustered in the best way. We could spend, you know, a year talking about adjudicating between the different ways of doing clustering. Like obviously the one I chose was the one that I thought was most valid for a study of this nature.
He you know, he did the same thing in Stata basically, and he came up with a table that's similar to yours. His confidence interval, and again, you people please discuss, leave me and Michelle out of it. But his confidence interval is using these different things, and again, this is all from the GitHub, the wonderful, you know, thank you so much for you know, doing that, because a lot of people don't do that. But for surgical mask, it's the confidence interval is 0.118 to 6.79. Or there's another one, 0.424 to 1.9. So
I don't know. Well, hold on. I don't know what those numbers are.
Okay. All right. Well, so he's, you know, he's, I mean, that's what, I mean, statistical significance, I don't see a p-value on here, but statistical significance, basically, if your confidence interval, you know, includes 1 or is close to 1. This is where, you know,
for the prevalence ratio, he's computing confidence interval. And tell me what he got again. It was,
so he got, you know, here for symptomatic seroprevalence with Poisson random effects model for the you know, on the variable surgical something surge. So I assume that's the you know, surgical mask, not the clot mask. He's getting 0.118 to 6.79. So I mean, he's getting a number
118 to 6.79.
Yes, and
that makes no sense. He made a mistake.
Right. And you know, you have for surgical mask 0.782 to 1.06.
That's not correct.
No, okay. But you know, it's fair. Without putting you on the spot here, just we had
well, no,
show,
I know. I don't mean to. I don't mean to. I'm not. My point is, he does have his stuff out there, and he is. You know, he's claiming.
That's what I was going to.
It's not remotely reasonable. Like if there's no way you could look at the data and be like, oh, well, the data is equally consistent with being 16.
Right. So my question is, do you, as part of these econometric analyses, do you run through multiple different models? Like I have no idea what one you should do. Should you
you could do something like that, but I actually think it's more correct to just say, like, here's what I think in advance is the best model to use. Like I think
that's fair. But Jason, I think what Anish maybe is alluding to, we had I think it's Brian Nosek, he's a clinical psychologist, but he's sort of the czar of the replication crisis, particularly in psychology, you know. And we had him on the show a couple of years ago, and he gave a data set. It was a fairly complex data set to analyze to 30 different teams of, you know, analysts, statisticians and whatnot
across the world.
And so they could choose their models, they could collaborate and whatnot. And then there was the entire spectrum of results, meaning not only the magnitude, but even the direction of the result varied depending on the model and whatnot. And these are good faith experts trying to.
Basically, what would happen if you did that for our study is that they would all be like symptoms decline by 10%. And for symptomatic seropositivity, I think you would find like there would be like some variation depending on what they decided to do, right? Like and it would be variation in both directions. Like some people would be like, oh, actually, you know, it's like more precise than we're saying, and some it's less precise. And that's just always going to happen. It's basically like, because essentially what you're saying is, well, look, you know, we have the normal source of error in our statistical models, which is like the error that's quantifiable, conditional on the model. And then there's a second source of error, which is like model uncertainty. So you might say, look, every statistical estimate that you have, you should just make the confidence interval bigger, because you've quantified the statistical uncertainty, but not the model uncertainty. And I agree with that in a Bayesian sense. Like that's an accurate statement to make about the world. The problem is I wouldn't like inflate my confidence intervals in the study just to do that, because it's like you want to facilitate comparisons between other people, other things that people have in their head. Remember, we're talking about an arbitrary standard in the first place of the p-value of 0.05. So like it's not the
no, 0.04 and 0.06 is not going to,
exactly.
Again, you're talking to people that aren't moved by that.
But the sort of the philosophical point that I'm making is that like what you want is something where people who have seen different studies can understand the strength of the evidence, right? Can be like, oh, how strong is the evidence in this compared to something else? And it's like a t-stat of a little more than 2. It's a p-value of like 0.043, and that is what it is. There's a reason that that's normally considered, pretty strong evidence. But it's also true that any study with a p-value of 0.043, if you give it to 30 teams to each choose how they want to specify it, they're not all going to get the identical thing. It's that like, that's always exactly this situation, which is that if people use different models, they might end up they might end up with different conclusions. So that is what 0.043 is. But let me just say one further thing, which is to say they'll end up with different conclusions. They would all agree that well, the treatment was less than the control. Like part of why we think 0.043 is relatively persuasive and 0.2 isn't that persuasive is if you start with 0.043 and you give it to 30 teams, they're all going to be like, oh yeah, treatment is less than control. If you start with 0.2 and give it to 40 teams, then it's like, well, you're going to end up with really different conclusions. So,
but you're saying it's basically impossible for you to take this data set and end up with 0.43 in one hands and 0.2 in the other hands. In terms of 0.04, sorry, 0.04, in one hand and 0.2 in the other hands.
I think it's unlikely. So I wouldn't put it that way, because it's like you made a slightly more precise claim than the claim. Like I was actually making a claim about this specific model or context we were discussing before. Like what is totally possible is like, the p-value, if you give it to different replication teams, could bounce around a lot. It's like 0.043 is what it is. Okay. And I'm saying it's not different in our study than other studies or whatever, but it is a thing where it's like, you have 0.043. It's good enough for the FDA to approve something. It's good enough for most physicians to be like, yes, this is probably an effective treatment. On the other hand, if you take any study where you have a p-value of 0.043, if you give it to 30 replication teams, some of them, when they analyze it, are going to get p-values of 0.3, and some of them, when they analyze it, are going to get p-values of 0.01. That's just how model uncertainty works, right? So
interesting. Yeah. Okay. So last statistical question. This is great, by the way, Jason. Thank you so much for your patience. I really appreciate it. It's really great to hear. There's an additional layer of complexity that's added to RCTs when you have a cluster RCT, right? Part of that relates to the fact that the folks that are all within the village, right? They are, as individuals, it's not that independent. They're not independent from each other, right? You're doing an intervention of the whole village, so there's some correlation. So there's this thing called the intracluster correlation coefficient, correct? Now, this intracluster, this raises another red flag to some of the folks who are critics of econometrics, in that we don't really understand what is the black box that is stata, right? Like what is, so for instance, the intracluster correlation coefficient is something that to me, as a intuitive person, it's like, okay, we should probably try to estimate it based on what you're doing, and there should be some pretest probability of what you think it is, right? Or at least that's what I would assume, that you would try to come up with that number based on what you know about what you think your intervention does. What's that?
There's not even a number we report in our study, because it's
right, exactly.
It's only needed for, it's like when you compute the correct standard errors in a cluster randomized study. So actually, there's two places this comes up, the intercluster coefficient. One is when we were doing, did we just go? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. There's two places this comes up. One is when we were doing power calculations. This was essential to try to make some guess as to what this would be, to understand how powered we would be. And then the second is when you're computing the p-values and the standard errors or whatever. Implicit in doing that is you're using these like cluster robust methods that are doing things that they're not even necessarily exactly calculating the intracluster coefficient rho, but they're like the types of adjustment that they are doing are implicitly dependent, and they're structurally related to the intracluster coefficient in a certain way. But the basic idea is like, look, you can actually see in the data how correlated things like the outcome is within and across villages. So you could have a world where in one super extreme world would be if one person is infected in a village, everyone is infected, right? And an opposite extreme would be if you learn that one person is infected, that carries no information about the probability that someone else is infected. And you can assess that in the data. And what the algorithm to compute the correct standard errors is implicitly doing is some adjustment based on the degree to which that's the case. But that is, you're totally correct. It's like an esoteric black box type thing where like, even for me, it's like I looked at years. It's not like, hey, every time I do a study, I'm gonna go back to the proof that I read 10 years ago and actually it's not 10 years ago because there's been new methods developed since then that are even better. But it's like, but it's like it's doing the details of that correction are quite esoteric and like obviously beyond the scope of what we can discuss here to try to understand like what the exact correct way to do that is and what the advantages are.
Right, but is the issue not? I mean, I definitely don't want to get into a discussion because it would be it would just be you talking. We would just be silently listening. We definitely don't want to get into that discussion.
That's my favorite kind of discussion.
But so no, we don't want to discuss what the intercorrelation coefficient should be. But is it concerning that like you basically take take this large data set, do all this stuff, and then you put it into Stata and write some function and it spits out something, and you and probably no one quite knows what Stata used.
Well,
because they're different.
It's not Stata. It's like I mean, it is Stata, but it's like it's not that Stata is coming up with this. It's that there's
I know.
A researcher who's like, here's the right way to do this. They program the code in Stata. I read the econometrics. And I'm like, that makes sense to me. I understand the rationale. Lots of other researchers use it. So over time, when there's errors, those errors are discovered. Like it is actually reasonably commonplace. Like it's like, I don't think this is a problem in this context. It's been so widely used, but it's like, it's reasonably commonplace that people will find this like a command where it's like, hey, 50 people use this, but then we're like, oh shit, there's a bug in it. We got to go back and we got to redo our thing. Because normally when that happens, it's not that like, because like when the person coded initially, they did all kinds of checks. So when there's bugs, it's not normally like, oh, it's all 30% or something. It's like, oh, there's some subtle case where it breaks down when you have this weird combination of factors. But this has been, the thing we're using here has been used widely enough that I'm not really worried about that. So this is just modern science, right? In modern science, there's division of labor. People write code, you rely on other people's code over time, the whole community figures out.
All right, so you don't think like, you don't think we should be using a different row for different things. You think like the same, so if somebody's doing a cluster, RCT, whether it be on infectious disease or whether it be on not infectious disease, we can use the same. Does that not make sense?
No, it's not the same row. It's a wildly different row for every.
So the row that's being used, what is it?
I'm not inputting a row.
You're not. I know, but how is Stata? How is whoever that coded Stata figuring out what row? So the row is calculated from the data. It's not something that you figure out and then you use it on your data. I understand. Okay.
All right, let me move the conversation to a place where we can have a leg up on Jason. Okay, one final.
Yeah, but we have so hold on. We'll get to you. We'll get to your point. So after all these things, we are going to move on from the protocol and details and statistics. That was my last question. So would it be possible, because I know I've seen some of your back and forth with many people. You have a lot of energy because clearly you're still up at this time. You're tweeting away at God knows what time all the time. But
normally I wake up at 11 a.m. But today I had a conference and they made me wake up at 8:15.
Oh, so good. We got you tired. So this is excellent. So is it possible, Jason, for a well-intentioned observer with a prior that's different than yours to come to a conclusion, to read the study, read the mask study and say, okay, I think masks are either not beneficial or they carry a small benefit? Is that is that within the realm of reasonable conclusions that one can come to reading your study?
Let me make an additional qualification to your question, because what I would say is, like, rationality is extremely difficult. Okay, so there's an implicit question, there's an implicit thing in your question, which is like, here's what I would, I would make a weaker claim than you made.
Okay.
I would say a well-intentioned observer with all the relevant training and the relevant experience, like, for example, someone who also designed and ran this type of trial and had done similar types of things, like, I don't think they could come to that conclusion. However, I certainly would not infer from the fact that someone came to that conclusion that they were not well-intentioned, because, as I said, like, that is quite a wealth of experience in many, many different dimensions that would be required in order to do that. So I totally think there are well-intentioned people who look at the trial and come to that conclusion.
But in fairness, Jason, isn't the people who put the effort and all the time and the energy that you have put into a study like this, don't they have, I mean, you, on your Twitter profile, I think you had a mask on for, like, you know, many months before the data. I mean, aren't people who sort of have sort of a bias towards wanting to show that masks are more effective?
I can tell you the history of my argument. Like, I'll tell you what my bias is. My bias is that I like when I'm right and other people are wrong, right? But it's like, if the trial had been like, hey, you know, there's just no evidence of this at all. Like, remember what was the situation in March of 2020? It wasn't like the situation was like all the, like, I'm just going with the flow. I'm just saying what the left wants or what the public health community wants. In March of 2020, I was saying, hey, I think that mask wearing seems like a good idea, given my interpretation of the evidence and my read of the existing evidence. And all the public health people were yelling at me on Twitter. So I was like, well, guess what? I'm going to do a big trial to try to get to the bottom of this. Now, guess what? If the results of the trial had been different, I would have been like, guess what, guys? I was right twice. because I'm actually the side, like, I would have been fine with that.
Fair enough. You know, Jason, in 2020, in March 2020, we had a very prominent infectious disease specialist on our show thinking that COVID was transmitted by fecal-oral route.
Yeah.
Right? So now I think, you know, we all know that you know, it's transmitted. There's a lot of things we don't know about transmission, but certainly we think that it's transmitted, you know, via aerosol ways, and therefore it makes sense that masks would have some effect. Now, you know, we know that people can get COVID through household contacts, meaning somebody in your face, your kid coughing, or you coughing in somebody else's face and whatnot. But you can also get it sort of more casually through interactions in the public sphere, right? I don't know that in your study you can tease, right? I mean, it's impossible to tease out.
Yeah, this is, and I would say this is fundamentally why we did this study, right? Like, I think, what is the actual uncertainty about masks? Like, we know that if you wear a mask and you cough into a petri dish, especially like a reasonably high quality mask, that it actually does filter a lot of viral particles.
Right.
So one uncertainty is like, well, what's the magnitude? But like, the real uncertainty, I think, is exactly what you said, that it's like, it's not like what masks realistically would be is you wear it 24/7 and every single person you encounter, you're wearing a mask. What it is like, we're encouraged to get in public areas, and then you go home and you go to your friend's house and none of you are wearing masks. And so you're all infecting one another. So
right. But can you tell from your study, I mean, you know, there were 20 cases, right? I mean, a difference of 20 cases. Well, those 20 cases, I mean, you couldn't tell. With 20 cases of preventing people coughing into each other, into each other's face and whatnot, versus, well, we don't know, right? We don't.
No. Okay. Again, two things to qualify. First, the 20 is not the relevant number, because it's about the difference in prevalence, which is effectively a little bit more than 100 cases. Okay. Secondly, that is exactly what the correctly calculated confidence interval is telling you. The correctly calculated confidence interval is telling you how much variability would you have in COVID cases by chance, how much variability is due to the treatment effect. So
but that's different. So I mean, I'm not disputing the confidence intervals or the treatments or the numbers or anything. I'm not disputing anything. At the end of the day, you don't know when you get the results, right? You get the results of how many people were symptomatic and seropositive in this group versus that group. We don't know, we agree. I agree that there's been a benefit of masks. I don't know if the benefit of masks is because it has reduced certain cases where there was an obvious, very close proximity in households, whatnot, versus masks have been effective in the mosque or in the marketplace.
Yes.
That's what I'm saying, right?
Sorry. I
yeah.
completely misunderstood your question. So that's completely right. And you can't infer that from the randomization. One of the reasons we made the data public is there's lots of additional modeling you could do. Like we can calculate a thing that we just looked at in the data is like, hey, how much more likely are you to be infected given that someone else in your household is infected? I think it's like 5 times more likely, something like that. Like, it's considerably more likely. So given those kinds of patterns, one could write down models to try to, estimate the kinds of things you're saying, but it's not something that we can just infer.
And I imagine that you would probably need a lot more robust difference, a bigger difference to be able to run those models.
Yeah, I think especially for symptomatic seropositivity, it would be difficult because it's like a relatively rare, although, it depends. Let me put it this way: it depends what variation you're using to identify different parameters. So like what you could do, in other words, the reason I'm saying such like a subtle and technical thing, I'm going to try to explain this, but I might not be able to, which is it's like you write down a model that has 5 different parameters. It could be that 4 of those parameters are identified by things in the data, but not about the treatment control comparison, by other what we call moments of the data, other ways in which the data varies. It's not the treatment versus control for symptomatic seropositivity. Maybe you have those 4 parameters identified from this other stuff, and then you have 1 parameter, just like we identified 1 parameter about the treatment control comparison, and then it might allow you to draw some of these conclusions. So I wouldn't quite want to make, I wouldn't make the strong statement you made that it's like, oh, just because you have a relatively imprecise estimate of the difference in symptomatic seropositivity, that you can't make these further distinctions using the data that we have provided. It just depends what we call moments of the data are identifying the different parameters of your model.
Okay, but I mean, still, my point was that it is, if we agree that your study showed an effectiveness of masks at reducing symptomatic COVID infections, we really don't know the context. Meaning, it could be that the masks are effective for those cases where people are, if they're hacking away and whatnot, there's less transmission from wearing a mask.
This is one, I mentioned earlier that we're redoing the trial. One of the huge things we want to figure out, I think there are many we don't remotely answer every question one could be interested in about masks. I could list 30 of them right here, but I'll mention one big one that we're trying to get in the follow-up trial, which is sort of along the lines of what you were just saying. It could be that one thing that masks do, it could be actually masks have no impact on the number of COVID infections, but they reduce the likelihood of symptomatic infections.
Because of the viral loads that you...
Exactly, viral load or something like that. Or it could be that the effect we're finding is actually about like infections prevented. And that's why in the follow-up study, we're going to power it to try to determine those, or to try to disentangle those, to try to say, oh, so get asymptomatic infections as well.
Right. But I'm sure you realize that this and you're a very nuanced guy. I mean, you really are very, very precise, and you understand all the nuances of all these things. But once your study is released, you don't have any control about how people interpret it. and the interpretation is going to be, we're going to mask everybody walking outdoors in the park and whatnot, because masks work and so forth and whatnot. How do you feel about that?
I don't like it when anyone misinterprets my study. I don't like it when people on the left do it. I don't like it when people on the right do it. That's why I constantly argue with people on Twitter who are misinterpreting my study.
So coming back to one of the things you said about would it be reasonable to come to different conclusions? Look, we're from the world of cardiology, right? And there's stents that go into coronary. Michelle places stents in patients that have coronary disease, and that is to this day, cardiologists are placing stents in patients with stable coronary disease, not in the setting of an acute MI. And there are many folks who are evidence-based gurus who will say that there is not a single trial that shows that there's a benefit from a mortality standpoint, say, right? There's a large trial recently that was done that also was negative again from a mortality standpoint, right? Yet it is the fact that the convention, and it is so ingrained within cardiology that you take somebody with high risk stable coronary disease, that we won't even randomize these patients to, and that's one of the problems why people think that the last trials failed. So I mean, randomized control time, these are much simpler trials than what you're trying to do, I think, right? You have, what you're trying to do, I think, is very.
The one thing I would say, though, about the
Yeah.
STEM trials is they have very big confidence intervals. So in other words, when they say that, like, oh, we don't find an effect, it's not that we're in some ways making opposite claims. Like, because we're saying, oh, we do find an effect, we rule out zero or whatever.
Right.
What they're saying is that we don't find an effect, but that's also, all the data is totally consistent with a world where stents have a 15% effect and it's like reduction in, heart attack, whatever, so
right.
Then you wouldn't want to necessarily take the trial and say, oh, there's no effect, let's not do them anymore, because you have to weigh the trial in light of the totality of the evidence and say, well, it's not that you don't find an effect, it's, do you actually, it's like, you can rule out an effect bigger than 50%, but you can't rule out a 15% effect. So is it still worth doing? What other evidence do we have that suggests there might be an effect? So it's a very different decision problem, is the way I would put it.
Perhaps, though again, the decision point that I think a lot of cardiologists are making for some of these patients that are very sick with stable CAD is that, for that person, they would do very badly. It's not that you're giving them a 5% reduction and we're missing that because
so if the trial shows that they're worse off and then we do it for them, then okay, then it's more analysis. Then it's like then.
Right. Well, I mean, I didn't mean to get bogged down in the details of things, but my point simply being, I just picked stents and stable CAD as one point of contention. There are many things that are points of contention in the world of cardiology, and in trials that are way simpler than what you're talking about, that are very nicely done and they're double blinded, etc. But again, nothing is so. And there's lots of people that are reasonable people on both sides that will that will disagree about what
I think I think you're being too vague about when we say, because I think what is certainly true that it's like someone says, hey, I have a trial, it showed something, and you're like, therefore we should do it. It's like, it's just too vague. It's like we need to say more about, like, it matters if the trial didn't find an effect or it did, and it matters like what the costs and benefits are.
Well, I just mean that there are lots of randomized control trials done in cardiology. I'm sure some of them, oncology and cardiology probably lead the way, right? And there's still a tremendous amount of controversy about what one should do about the patient who's in front of you based on that, based on the data, is all I'm saying. So, mask RCTs, we have not nearly as many as we do freaking cardiology RCTs, and you're bound to have differences. You've actually you've reviewed the DanaMask, the Danish mask trial, right? And the Danish mask trial, had an 18% reduction in I forget what exactly their endpoint was, some symptom-based thing, and their confidence interval was minus 46% to positive 23%, right? And so some people look at that and have concluded that masks do not work, and you've nicely shown and you're now the king of masks. Anyone that has a question on masks must come to you and ask, well, what does the king say? And you've said that and you've logically reasoned through why it is that the DanaMask trial actually is most consistent with showing a benefit, right? I've read some of your things. Now, I'm not.
What I would say is,
it's possible.
It's not that I say that it shows a benefit. It's that I think it would be. I think it is a deep misreading to read it and say that it shows that masks do not work. I think it is consistent with a world where they're beneficial, and I think it actually has like relatively little information because they don't measure compliance. So it's like what I would say about it is not, oh, I look at the DanaMask trial and I'm like, that's pretty good evidence that masks work. I look at it and I'm like, there's not
yes.
Like,
meaning, but you based on your prior, and your prior is informed by the fact that you're wearing masks in March based on your reading, and then you did this massive Bangladesh RCT. So your prior leads you to parse this and kind of dissect DanaMask to be like, it's consistent with the benefit, even though you have these insane confidence intervals and this point estimate and whatnot. I would suggest that there are folks that have different priors than you have, correct?
Oh, of course.
And, those different priors, not bad faith, motivate them to say, you know what, I'm going to read the Bangladesh RCT and the DanaMask trial together, and I'm going to come to a conclusion
Yeah, let me be clear. I don't think everyone who criticizes our trial is acting in bad faith. I think like
what about people that say that masks don't work?
I mean,
to stop COVID.
I don't know. Like
in the community masking. Community masking.
I think if someone said what the trial shows is that masks don't work, then I think one of two things is true. Either they're acting in bad faith or they're making a mistake. And it's
what if they're saying it could be just like, what if they're saying it could be consistent with masks not working or having no?
Yeah, I'd say if someone said, look, like I looked at the trial and I think it could be consistent with masks having a small or no effect, then I'd be like, I think it's a slightly misleading claim, but it's like, the question is, what do they mean by could be consistent? And it's sort of just like a weasel way of describing a study.
But I mean,
like the way,
because it gets to the reason I'm bringing this up is because these things have massive impacts on folks that are sitting, you know, there are schools that are continuing to mask children. I know that's a different thing. Yeah.
But let me give my opinion on this, right? Like my opinion is that we need to do calculations. Okay. My opinion is when I see people and they have really strong views on a question like, should people wear masks in schools? Or whether it is they're like, oh yes, it's a no-brainer, everyone should wear masks in schools. Or they're like, no way should people wear masks in schools. I immediately think less of them because like, unless they have published a paper where they're like, here is my quantitative calculation where I evaluated this issue. Because it becomes clear from, now there are some issues where, you know, without doing a careful calculation, you can have like a reasonable opinion where you're like, hey, should we, you know, just kill 1 million people, whatever, you know, it's like, okay, but that's not this. Because it becomes clear from even a moment's consideration that the issues involved, there's really a tremendous amount of uncertainty and you need to make lots of assumptions and do an explicit analysis to resolve that uncertainty.
Understood.
So my view of all of those issues is anyone who has a strong opinion about masks in school or the long run impact of masks on COVID or whatever, if they haven't done a calculation, they're bullshitting. Like, or they're overconfident is what I would say.
But why is the default? How did the default become mask? And then the only way we can be strong about, say, taking off the mask is you showing me your quantitative calculation that says that masks do not work.
I didn't say that. I didn't say that.
Oh,
no, right. No, you didn't say that. But Jason, I mean, actually, no, but my point is that actually these questions cannot really be settled by studies because there's nothing from your study that can give me any confidence to extrapolate, right, and to generalize to saying that this is what we need for schools for kids in schools.
Oh, it can't
right?
be.
Yeah, and you agree that you agree. I think you agree.
I'm not saying our study resolves that question. But what I'm saying is, if someone has a strong opinion about that, what I want them to do is to do a calculation. I want them to say, here are the factors that I'm weighing. I am weighing that if kids do wear masks in schools, here are the costs of it. The costs are A, that they're uncomfortable, B, that there's this impact on learning, you know, whatever else. Yeah, maybe if it's young kids, there's some other costs. I don't know. Here's the cost. And then I want them to enumerate the benefits. I want them to say, here's my assumption about how many fewer kids will get COVID. Here's how many of them will die. Here's how many secondary infections there will be. I want them to be explicit about the assumptions they're making and the costs and benefits.
But do you think the empiricism is that worked out that anyone
can
do that with a...
Right, but Jason, you know the quip.
You're saying it's very uncertain.
No, but you know the quip that not everything that counts can be counted, right? I mean, that's the quip. So
I'm not saying that the calculation tells you a definitive answer. I'm saying that the calculation tells you how to quantify the uncertainty given the evidence available.
Yeah, but there may be things that I feel strongly about that aren't quantifiable. I mean, you can't quantify my assessments of the impact of a mask on my kids, you know, 5 years down the line. There are many things that you can't.
I would not say that. The way I would put it is the following: because math,
you're very precise.
All that math is a language for expressing things precisely. So if you can talk about it in English, you can talk about it with math.
Right, but to quantify things precisely that are quantifiable. I mean, to talk about things precisely that are quantifiable.
What I would say, I'll acknowledge your point to this extent. I'll yield a little bit. Here's what I'll yield. I'll say there are some concepts like dignity that we don't have a great mathematical understanding of yet.
Yeah. Oh, love. How much do I love my wife? How much you?
I wouldn't say that it's not quantifiable, but what I would say is we don't have the language to quantify it, or we don't have the mathematical tools to quantify it yet.
All right. Well, Jason, well, let's take, again, we can quibble about, well, the quibble, the disagreement we have is about, well, how strong, because this is what we've been talking about for the last hour and a half, is like, okay, the empiricism, and how strong is it, and how fragile is it to all these assumptions that need to be made to come up with that final bottom line number. So that's one issue.
No, exactly.
But the other issue,
when it comes to math in schools, they're really uncertain. There's a ton of uncertainty about like things like how will it impact learning? Like there's a ton of, and just even the impact on COVID. There's lots of things. Like I think, but not all estimates are created equal either. There's lots of things that we do know about where we could do that are more reasonable than others. So perhaps do a calculation.
But let's take something that we don't need, that is blindingly obvious. And this touches on Michelle's point, that we don't need a study for. I hope no one's going to do this RCT, because it would be so grandma is 85 years old. And she has a 12-year-old grandkid, and she wants to visit him in the middle of a pandemic. All right. We don't need a study to know that grandma puts herself at higher risk by visiting little Johnny. She clearly does. Is it the role of a econometrician or a public health person to disallow 88-year-old, 85-year-old grandmother from
I mean, in all fairness, they don't disallow it, but they provide. Right, you don't disallow it, but you provide sort of ammunition for people who want to disallow it, or you. Right, or you might. You provide the. Right.
First, let me be the policymaker, and then I'll be.
Okay, all right. Great. Actually, I love econometricians who dare to be the policy, because most of the time they say, "Oh, I just show the data. I don't make the policy." Right.
Let's talk about what the policymaker should do first. So,
all right.
So, like for the policymaker, there are two questions here, right? There is the paternalistic issue and what we call the externality issue. So the paternalistic issue is, should we say to the grandmother, in order to protect the grandmother, that you cannot visit your sick grandchild? The externality issue is, should we say to the grandmother, in order to protect everyone else in her nursing home, that you cannot visit your sick grandchild, right? Now, these are very different from a normative perspective, right? Because like, I think the paternalistic version, you better have a damn good reason for thinking that the grandmother is going to make a very, very bad mistake from her own judgment before you would say, just to protect her, right? You can't visit your sick grandchild, because like, why shouldn't she be able to decide that for herself? So I think there we should have a strong deference that, she should be allowed to put herself in danger and visit the sick grandchild. Like the one exception I would say is, suppose we did a bunch of studies and every study showed that grandmothers were like, hey, I can visit my sick grandchild and nothing will happen to me. And they kept dropping dead. And they did it time after time after time. Then you might be like, okay, maybe for paternalistic reasons, we want to stop them from dropping dead. But I'd say the evidentiary burden there should be very high before we step in and do that. Because, you're imposing a considerable burden on them. They really want to see their sick grandchild. That's a big part of how they get meaning, or they really want to see their grandchild. That's how they get meaning in their life, right? So that's one thing. Then there is the question of the externality, right? There is the question of, well, when you have infectious diseases, there are things that people do that are harmful to them, but also impose a cost on their neighbors. Now things become much trickier, because we know that if there are externalities, that people won't make the right decision. If there are externalities, people will see their sick grandchild, even though they might be imposing considerable harm on everyone else in the nursing home, and so much harm that if they took it into account, they might not do that. Now, there are all kinds of questions about what the best way to internalize that externality is. Does it have to be the federal government that steps in and says, you can't visit your sick grandchild? It's one potential way of doing it. Or maybe you want to have nursing homes make that decision based on their more local assessment of the risks of whether they want to allow visitations or what they want to allow to, it's a complicated question, and you need to, so it's not clear cut to me, but I would certainly want to distinguish between the paternalistic rationale for it and what I call the externality point, where we know that people will not be taking into account the harms that they're imposing on us.
Unfortunately, it's impossible to remove externalities from whatever, even if she's not living in a single room with 10 people, in a nursing home. I mean, there's that grandmother's always part of a community of other grandmothers,
it's impossible to remove them, but it's
the grandmother, when she gets sick, will go to a hospital, right? When she goes to a hospital, she will see me or Michelle and has a chance of infecting us.
I agree with you. So if what a politician said was, hey, there is a possibility of externalities, therefore I'm not going to do any calculation, I don't have any quantitative basis for this, there's a possibility of externalities, therefore no one visit their grandchild, that would seem to me that they were not acting prudently, that they were not making a reasonable decision. Like, I think if they're going to make a decision like that, where they're potentially imposing considerable harms on people, that they should have a pretty reasonable and defensible quantitative basis for that. Now, what I would say is it's possible that they have that in the nursing home case. I can't prejudge it. I would need to.
But you're subjecting everything to some quantitative basis. So there are no rights. Your rights may go away depending on what quantitatively the externality may be.
There are rights, but like I would be broadly consequentialist in understanding the purview of the government and understand in like what the extent of those rights should be.
I agree with you, but the problem is that the externalities of the interventions are frequently not taken into consideration, or right? I mean,
they're always everything the government does is reasonable. I would say two things. I think it is frequently the case that political decisions are made on a poor basis, and I also agree with everything you guys are saying that I shouldn't ignore that as a researcher. I don't think as a researcher I should be like, well, I'm going to put stuff out there in the world and people will do with it whatever. And that is why that I constantly yell at people on Twitter on the left and the right when people are like, hey, people are like, Jason, like, oh, they retweet me and they're like, shouldn't we have masks in schools? That I answer them, I'm like, actually, we have to be careful, blah, 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 blah. And people are like, oh, this stupid study, they're blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, no, blah. I think we have to be aware of this. And we were thinking hard about this when we designed the study. It's like, what are the consequences likely to be?
No, but that's very good, because Jason, so now point blank, to what extent does your study or study which you're going to replicate, and I'd like to hear more about that. I mean, how does that help the policymaker to know that in Bangladesh in 2020, over a 6-month period, when a pandemic was doing this particular intervention of giving mayors $100 and bringing cricket players on video and whatnot, and having monitors and whatnot, had the result of this reduction in infection. How is that going to help us here today?
Okay, so first of all, you could say this about any study. There's
right.
Always
that's generally what I say.
Fundamental question about research. It's like, how are we going to, what are we going to do with it, right? And it's like, so what I would say is here is how I would I think the reason to do the study and the reason to hope that it might actually be beneficial for the world, right? There are some decisions, many decisions, that are not going to be made on the basis of numbers at all, period. No one's going to care about the study, whatever. There are those decisions, okay? There are other decisions where there are a lot of people in the world who actually do care what the evidence says. There are a lot of people who are trying to make reasonable judgments, right? There are people who, they're your state government and you're trying to say, hey, should we have an indoor mask mandate in public areas? Should we say if you enter the post office that you have to wear a mask, right? And sometimes it's totally political, right? It's
sometimes
not always. Okay. But actually not always. I think there are people, especially sort of the lower down you go. Mm-hmm. It's in government, the more it becomes the case that it's just there are people who are like, yeah, I don't know. I have to decide this, right? And I think there's rules of thumb. I understand that no one, it's they're not going to take my study and then estimate the structural model to do the correct external validity calculations or whatever. No, what I hope will happen, by the way, is some people will do that. They'll try to evaluate, researchers will try to evaluate policies and add to the existing knowledge by building on our study in that way. But then also, what I would hope policymakers would do in the short term is, you kind of take the heuristic guidance from it. And what is that heuristic guidance? On the one hand, is it the case that masks are going to like prevent anyone from getting COVID? No, it's like, that's just not going to happen, right? It's like, maybe they could reduce COVID cases by like 30%, something like that. You know, we give a bunch of different estimates, and obviously you need a bunch of assumptions to get those estimates, right? Suppose it's 30%. Then I think what you say is like, look, in the States, if you're in a state where 95% of people are vaccinated and almost no one is dying of COVID, you know, mask mandates probably are not a high priority. It's not obvious that they're wrong to me, that they're like, oh, terrible idea, but it's like the benefits of them are just going to be smaller. On the other hand, if you're in a state where the death toll from COVID is really substantial, then it's like, okay, this is probably a reasonably cost-effective way relative to the other things that you could do of trying to combat COVID, to say in crowded indoor public areas, we're going to try to encourage people to wear masks, especially if they're poorly ventilated. So it's not that we should ignore anything of our study. It's like, you know, I think what you hope will happen, it is certainly the case that like the world is what economists call second best, right? There's lots of things that go wrong for lots and lots of reasons. And what you hope a study like this will do is like add to a body of scientific knowledge that accumulates over time that results in, you know, reasonable rules of thumb, where people aren't like hopefully what happens is after, you know, years and years of this study and also our replication, other replications and other similar studies and everything, you know, you get to a place where people are like, okay, you know, based on our study, we don't know much about the indoor versus outdoor. We can't say that that would be based on other studies, but maybe it's like, you know, based on other studies, it seems like, at least for COVID, outdoor.
Are you worried about some of the punitive things that could happen? I know you suggested in March of 2020, I don't know if you still think this, that federal or state government should immediately purchase 12 cloth masks for everyone, strongly encourage everyone to wear masks when in public, and perhaps even fine them if they don't. Is that something that you'd be in favor of based on?
I think it totally depends on the context. I think the national situation has changed because of the presence of vaccines. Like there were no vaccines in March of 2020. Yeah. It is now the case that there are some places where I think the risk of death from COVID is pretty low because almost everyone is vaccinated. Now that might change in a month. I don't know, like, you know.
Right. But you know, but the nuance that you display in terms of, okay, this is further on the pandemic, et cetera, and stuff, that's going to be lost on a lot of people, right? So I mean, that was March 2020. Just last week, Merrick Garland, you know, almost a Supreme Court justice, said that he's planning to, the Justice Department is planning to step up prosecution of unruly airline passengers because of what's happened last year. And the vast majority of those are face covering incidents that are happening, right? So again, you see this turn towards punitive stuff that makes me a little concerned.
I'm not so.
And they'll use
the airline stuff doesn't bother me so much in the sense that it's like that's a clear externality case where it's like, you know, and again, I think we should like calculate costs and benefits. It's like if you I think there's some cases, it's not that my view is we definitely need to, and like and again, and also we have to be clear, it's like how punitive are we being and what are the people doing? Like if a person gets on a plane and you're like, hey, please wear a face mask or we're not going to lift off, and then, you know, they start harassing the flight.
What if the guy says that, no, I've read Abaluck study and, you know, I think the patients are unblinded, and if you use different models, this may change that, so I don't really think I have to wear a mask.
Yeah, but that's not like that's not how you make policy with respect to externality.
Right. But I mean, clearly to be the most nuanced is going to be at the most local level, right? To take into account the various circumstances. Now, Jason, what is your replication study? Your attempts? I mean, are you going to try to narrow the context to be a little bit more specific, so we can maybe generalize a little bit more easily?
Well, actually, no. It's actually
the opposite.
Context, but we're very deliberately, because one thing, like, we actually want to cross-cut with the existing villages because we want to learn something from the fact that it's like, okay, we had this impact earlier, now we're going to cross-cut with them, but also the main novelty of the new study is trying to do blood tests for everyone, not just the symptomatic people, which deals with a concern about, like, you know, people misremember symptoms. You know, symptoms are can be tricky to elicit. So it's like, now we're just going to do blood tests for everyone. It also adds this additional dimension, which is what's the impact of masking on asymptomatic infections.
Okay. So your endpoint will be seroprevalence, just period.
Yeah, just period seroprevalence. And actually seroconversions, because we're going to try to test everyone at baseline and end line. That's actually very tricky. So the thing that's tricky about it is I actually think that based on some data we've collected, that seroreversions, especially over like a many month time period, are fairly common. And so you can't always see seroconversions just from baseline and end line tests. So anyway, short answer is, there will be plenty of complicated math for us to talk about in a year.
But right, so aren't you concerned? You repeat it. Let's say it's negative, and yet you could see that there's a way in which if the study was conducted differently, or if the context were a little bit different, it could be
a very reasonable
positive and whatnot.
I think there's a very reasonable chance to repeat it. And again, this is a major concern. Like when we try to power the study and design everything else. So here's what I think is maybe like the modal outcome of doing this follow-up study. The modal outcome is no new variant takes off, there's more immunity, there's some vaccination in Bangladesh. So we have lower rates of COVID than we saw the first time. And then guess what happens? We end up finding no significant effect, but we can't rule out an effect that's the same as what we found the first time. And then we would publish that and we'd be like, hey, here's what we found. We did this study that found a 10% effect. We did another study where the point estimate was the point estimate was an 8% effect, but it's not statistically significant this time. What does the totality of this say? Well, it's all consistent with a 10% effect, but or maybe we do this other study and, we see a 30% effect, or another study, we see a precise 0. I think we'll learn something.
How much money did it cost, Jason?
That's the new study or the old study?
No, the old study.
The old study?
No, yeah, the old study. The one you just completed.
The old study I think it was $2.6 million. The new study is like $3.2 million.
Okay.
Yeah, I
mean, definitely not. This is definitely not. This study. So all these studies are going to be done in Bangladesh. They're not going to be done in other venues, I guess.
And there's a number of reasons for that. One is actually the humanitarian reason that I think that actually, as we've been discussing, where masks most urgently needed, where fewer people are vaccinated. So that's why we're doing this. In that, we could try to find a place in the United States where a few people are wearing masks, but those are obviously places, or where a few people are vaccinated, but those are obviously places where you're going to get political resistance to mask wearing.
I see. Well, Jason, this has been a fantastic few hours.
Wait, I have a request. I have a request for you guys.
Oh, yes.
My request for you guys is, and this is very related to what we've been discussing, which is, I think, so as I was saying, I think there are people who are good faith critics of the study. Obviously, I think they're mistaken for all the reasons we've discussed. I think that we did this analysis correctly. I think there's good faith critics. There's also lots of bad faith critics. And so I think it is very helpful. What I would say is helpful is for people like you guys who would sometimes have expressed skepticism about the study to be it's not that I expect that I change your mind about everything, but to be like, hey, Jason came on and said lots of reasonable things. And, whatever the strongest statement you're willing to make is that actually people who are looking at this study and are like, oh, these stupid egghead academics, whatever, the people who look at it scornfully, maybe they'll think twice because they see people like you guys who they've heard say different things, be like, oh, actually, this was not a crazy person who was just dogmatic.
No, that's why we brought you on. That's why, coming on the show buys you respectability, sirs.
All right, I appreciate that.
So certainly not. There will be no tomatoes thrown.
And I'm sure it'll be.
I think what's definitely clear is that there's obviously a lot of thought that went into the study. And there's a lot of there's not some attempt. There's not some bad faith attempt to clearly demonstrate masks work when they clearly don't work and stuff. I think there's a lot. There's a lot of reasonable. It's fair. Again, and we may disagree about this. There's a lot of reasonable, limitations in every study, and the limitations may, of course, impact the end line conclusion. And it's
I think there's clear limitations. The thing that the only claim I would make is that I think that. What I do think is true is that when I describe the study to other people who have the expertise in running these types of studies, as well as the econometric expertise in evaluating it, that they update and that they consistently move in the same direction, which is that, this provides pretty solid evidence that masks have some effectiveness. Now, there's still tons of uncertainty about things like the long run effectiveness. It's like, oh, hey, maybe people make arguments. They're like, hey, everyone's going to be infected anyway. That's a complicated question.
It's that Tyler Cohen in his blog Merge Revolution, he kind of, you can tell he's kind of over mass. He's like, you know what, I'm not going to say anything about mass anymore.
He's Twitter followers are as well. It's too bad.
Yeah, he's like, we got to focus on more high yield things, and but yeah, I think there's that. There's certainly a appreciation on this end that there's a lot of effort that went into doing what was a incredibly energy intensive trial to come up with a result that was robust. But
But I appreciate, Jason, I think your point is very well taken. And I certainly, you come across, just these 2 hours you spent here as extremely reasonable, extremely nuanced, very aware of all the limitations and all that stuff. But so in turn, I'm going to ask you to just maybe take to heart the position of those who think that there are many, many important things that are not going to be resolved by empirical studies, no matter how well conducted they are, no matter how well carefully interpreted they are. And
again, my view of the world is that my view. I think I was making a philosophical claim about a point at infinity that maybe is construed about how much knowledge we have today, right? It's the knowledge we have today is really limited about the way I think about all academic studies is it's sort of there's 2 ways you could make decisions about the world. You could just go around and you could not care about science and things at all. And it's maybe you get things right. It's imagine if by doing things that way, you get things right 50% of the time. Then it's with academic studies, it's if you do all the best studies and everything, maybe you get things right 52% of the time. So it's not suddenly because you've done this study and you've been as rational as you possibly could, suddenly you get to perfection. It's no, the world is awash in uncertainty and there's a million things that you always haven't taken into account. It's no, if you really carefully attend to all these things, you could do slightly better. And over time, those advantages accumulate and that drives the progress of civilization.
That's the theory.
It's a theory.
But the other thing I was going to say is, when
we can put it to the test.
When the public hears how much time we spent talking about the intracluster correlation, your audience will immediately multiply by 10. So I think it's going to be great for your podcast. I think it's going to be great for you guys. So
no, it was. I can't. 2 hours of your day is incredibly. It was very kind of you to give it to us and to so patiently explain all the different things. So we really do appreciate it. So
terrific.
We'll see you on Twitter. Your Twitter handle is. Go ahead. Tell us again what it is.
At Abaluck. So my first initial J and then my last name Abaluck.
We'll have that on the show notes as always.
Excellent.
Jason, thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Yep, bye-bye.